Hello, my name is Aubrey Starika, and I am a student in Dr. Dan's class on applied survey design. And I'm going to talk about what I've learned in the last 7 weeks. And I've learned a lot. I'm going to try to summarize it, but summarizing is usually pretty hard for me. I'm a little wordy. So let's start off. Okay. So in week 1, I basically learned about survey fundamentals and terminology. I learned about the different scales. I learned about the different graphs, and I learned about different words that I need to fully understand and will continue to use a lot during my research. So scales range from the continuous scale, the interval scale, the ratio scale, the ordinal scale, and the nominal scale. So nominal means there's no meaningful order. Ordinal means it's categorical. And interval means there's equal segments along the way. And continuous is forever. And ratios, you have to remember that ratios are quantitatives, and it has a true zero. The zero does mean something. So think of it like this. Continuous is infinity, forever and ever. Nominal is something, for example, like gender. Ordinal, you could use the word generations. Intervals, you could use Fahrenheit, and scales. And then ratios, you could use something like length or width. And key terms that I learned in week 1 were validity, which basically is a key to everything. It shows that you measure what you were intended to measure. You have the verbal scale that's represented through spoken or written words with that. Bias, you're going to see bias a lot of places, and that is a person that has an opinion before they come into the survey. There are certain ways to work around bias and try to minimize it, and we'll go into that later. The word factor, we ran into that a lot, and that's a dimension of a construct. And item is also another word that is a question or a statement. There are convenience samples that are out there for surveys, and those are really easy, and people just use available people along the way. So along with these scales and data that we're collecting, and we're trying to get the validity, we're trying to avoid bias, we've got different questionnaires, we've got scales ranging from ordinal, nominal to interval, ratio. Then we're also going to have graphs that we're going to be looking at and interpreting this data on graphs. So you have a box plot, and that will help you. Those are the little boxes with the dots outside of them. If there's dots outside of them, those are outliers. So box plots are used for outliers, and they can distribute information into quartiles. Surveys have the questionnaires, and they assess the phenomenons. And scatter plots show connections between variables. So you'll see all those little scattered little circles along the line, and you'll see if they're close to the line or if they're not close to the line. And histograms show frequency of distribution. And so that's about it for week 1. Again, it was just summarizing basically fundamentals and terminology. It went into all the different scales. It went into certain words that you really need to understand and learn. And it went into the different graphs where we're going to be putting our data to help interpret our information on our dissertations. So week 2 was probably my favorite week, even though I hated the quiz on that. But it had to do with surveys. It had to do with scale design, inclusive language, and again, bias. So it is very important on your survey design to figure out what that scale of measurement is. It's very important to use different types of inclusive language. So when I say inclusive language, you want to be careful about diversity. You want to be mindful of language. You want to use experts. You don't want to just have... You want to be really careful with how you say questions, ask questions, so you don't offend people. You want to allow people to skip questions if they want to. You want to put demographics at the very end of the questionnaire in case people get a negative idea or kind of get scared and quit. And those are the main things that you need to think of to improve inclusivity on a survey. But this is very, very important. So again, mindful of language. You want to acknowledge diversity. You want to be careful with your questions. You want to try to avoid any biases. And that's it for that. So on designs of scales, a lot of them, the most popular one is the Likert scale, and that is typically 5 questions. It starts with negatives, 2 negatives in the beginning, a neutral, and then 2 positives. If you go beyond that and get to 6 or 7 or whatever you might have on there, you're going to have what's called anchors, one at the beginning and one at the end of that scale. We always start with the negative choices and end with the positive choices. You don't want to ever have on a scale, say 3 positives and 2 negatives, because that is not a fair scale that you're giving the employees. So you don't want untrained employees to ever do the surveys because they don't know what they're doing, and they can come up with data that's very, it doesn't have validity and it is not reliable. It's just best if a trained professional does this. And as we learn throughout this class, it's very important to know what you're doing when you're putting together survey questions before they even go out. Surveys should be meticulously designed, and there are many rules and procedures that should be followed when doing a survey. Again, with the demographics, you want to always put them at the end of the survey because they can create anxiety and mistrust. If there is not a lot of trust in the organization, then just take the demographics out or just put a couple of them at the end of the survey. With surveys, there's a lot of things to remember about surveys, a lot of commonly asked questions. Shorter surveys can get a higher response rate, but now if you have a larger population, you want to use a larger survey. Most surveys take about 30 minutes with about 50 to 80 questions. Now, some will argue that if somebody is committed to the material and really interested in it, it doesn't matter how long that survey is or how long it takes. They're going to do it because they're committed and engaged in the topic. Sometimes negative words are important in the survey because it kind of gets people to stand up and talk about their point of mind on things. So that is important. We go into a surveys, what's better? Is it better online or mail in? And people had various answers on that, but more than likely it's good to have both versions available, but now in our day and age, it's mostly internet needed. And some people always ask on surveys, like, what's a minimum number of people that need to respond? And again, that depends on the target population you are trying to target. When you're doing surveys, you want to make sure you get a good range of people from your target audience. If you were just doing it from a normal group of males and females and you had 70% male and 30% female, that would not be a good range of your target audience. So, week 3, we went into identifying appropriate populations for research studies, and we learned how to choose the appropriate sampling measures that are needed to get the best sample, things that I was just talking about in week 2. Bottom line, we learned how to administer the survey and how challenging it can be to get your target population. As it measured in week 1, we learned about convenient sampling, which you just grab the people that are convenient. Not the best way of sampling, but again, it just depends on your validity. What are you trying to measure? Now, some samples are underrepresentative of the employees, and some are not generalized a lot. We have to try to work to not have that happen. And management support in surveys is shown if they allow to do them at work. However, management can also incentivize their employees, like, hey, here's a bag of donuts if you do it before work. That is also allowed. Don't give your surveys during holidays. Do it during normal budget, statistical procedures, whatever the day-to-day is. Do not do it during holidays. Now, a lot of good things can come from the survey. If you have a very valid survey that can help organizations get to the bottom of what's going on, what needs to be fixed, and basically focus on what can be improved and make the workplace better. So if you have a good survey, it can reduce your turnover, it can reduce your it can increase your retention, reduce absenteeism, reduce turnover. It can make your employees happier and more productive. So there's a lot of good that can come from different surveys. We have what's called a stratified survey out there. Now that is more time consuming. It is more accurate, but it does take a lot more time and a lot more cost. More than likely, people will just do a normal survey unless they have different means where they need to do the stratified survey. So ways to improve surveys are to allow people to skip questions, work on your inclusive language, allow the demographics to be at the end of the survey. If trust is an issue, only use a small amount of demographics. Be sure that you're getting the appropriate population for the survey. Be sure that you're administering the survey correctly. Make sure you're not doing it on holidays. Make sure you can do little segment surveys along the way that can check attitudes and the pulse of how things are going. It's very important that management is on board and supporting the surveys. And that's about it for week 3. And we identified populations for research people and what people are interested. We learned how to choose appropriate sampling measures and to acquire the proper representation of the people of larger populations of interest. So week 3 was very important. Okay, so week 4 was a lot of fun. Week 4 is where you have your data and you're learning how to clean that data and screen that data, interpret that data, and manipulate that data. And we learned this in Jamovi. I learned how to screen and read raw materials. I learned that as I was looking along the raw numbers, if let's say that everything filled out but 1 or 2 were gone, but you saw the pattern and the average of numbers, I could use this thing called imputation and put the numbers in it. I learned in Excel how to do sums, averages, and reverse coded items in Excel in Jamovi. I learned how to screen and read the raw data. I learned about, there's 3 different types of screening, and that is direct, archival, and instructed. So archival is basically you're looking at a bunch of things that were from the past, and it includes things like semantic synonyms, antonyms, response times, and long string. And then you have statistical. Now, statistical is statistical psychometrics, antonyms and synonyms, and Mahalanobis D. That is your statistical, and that is basically just statistics in different forms. Now, direct is a really good screening method. I would use this on all my surveys. Direct is when you go in and you ask the people at the end of the survey, like, what was your level of effort in the survey? Did you answer honestly? Did you answer accurately? And this is really important because you get done with the survey and you see that people said, oh no, I lied, or I didn't answer accurately. You can throw out some of their data. So I would say that direct is a very important form of screening. So that was it for week 4, but that was a very important week because screening your data and cleaning your data is very important. If you would clean it by, like, let's say somebody left out a lot of answers, then you've got to clean it and get rid of it. If you saw a pattern where everybody did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you got to get rid of that. If you saw 1 or 2 missing, like I said before, you would use what's called imputation. And so you're basically organizing, interpreting, and analyzing your data and making it all make sense at this point in the data collection for your survey. So week 5, that's where we get into writing things up APA style, and it has to do with inferential and descriptive statistics. So you're basically taking your data and you need to be able to explain what your data did, what data sets were generated. You have to be able to analyze, interpret, apply, report descriptive statistics. You have to explain what is going on. What did the statistics show you? You're going to use, again, like in chapter 1, week 1, we use the box plots, we use the scatter plots, the frequency tables, and the histograms. All of those you're also going to be using in Jamovi. So Jamovi has the different scales of measurements, and then they use things, let's say you're trying to get an outlier, you would use box plots and be able to write the terms in APA style, how many outliers that data had, and you can show it with the box plot, and then you can write about it. That would be something you would do in your dissertation. So I interpreted, I ran analysis on scatter plots, on histograms. I did the descriptive statistics with APA style. I learned a lot about inferential and descriptive statistics. I learned how to apply all that data with the different graphs, and I just basically learned all about using Jamovi and what different items I could get from Jamovi and interpret and analyze and explain in written words. So week 6, back to validity, like what we talked about in week 1. So week 6 talks about validity and reliability, and that is something that you need in your dissertations and everything. It is everything. Now, Cronbach's alpha, that was applied in Jamovi, and that helps determine reliability results. We use that a lot. Validity of data was explored in the Pearson correlation, which I will go into shortly. Now, I learned how to generate, analyze, and interpret findings, again, with Pearson's correlations, and in t-tests, and in Cronbach alpha. I learned how to do different things when evaluating reliability and validity and the differences between the variables. I also learned about criterion validity and practical assumptions. So in order for something to be a Pearson's correlation, it has to meet a few assumptions. And they are, both variables has to be quantitative. It has to be normally distributed. It can't have any outliers, and it has to be a linear regression. So to test, if we use a Pearson's, if you ran a box plot and there are outliers, you can't use a Pearson's. So again, normally distributed, has to be linear, no outliers, and it has to be quantitative. So I also learned a lot about the p-values and the r-values and the different effect sides, and how to see if you have a certain r-value, if that p-value is statistically significant with different variables. For example, you could be in Jamovi and say, how does skin tone affect guilt and empathy? Does guilt go up and does empathy go down? And you could do the analysis in Pearson's, and you could see, even if it's a negative, but it's still statistically significant, meaning it's below 0.05, then that's just a negative result, but the effect is minimal. So you just have to learn what all of that means and how to read it in Pearson's. So if Pearson's doesn't have everything that I just mentioned, then you would use you have to have alternative correlations, and there are a lot of alternative correlations. And one of these is Spearman's. So Spearman's is basically the opposite of everything Pearson's has, and only 1 or 2 variables in that need to be met for Spearman's to be used, meaning it could be nonlinear, there could be outliers, it could not be quantitative, it could be ordinal. There's all the opposites of what Pearson's is Spearman's, and you only have to meet 2 of those, and then you can do different analysis on what is statistically significant with Spearman's. So again, In week 6, we learned about Spearmans, we learned about Pearsons, we learned about Cronbach alpha, we learned to find out all the differences, we did a deeper dive into validity and reliability, and that's about it. Had a lot of a deeper dive into Jamovi, so week 6 was really good. So week 7, correlation analysis. So correlation analysis, we explored different variables and relationships between those variables in correlation analysis. So I was able to better understand assumptions, meanings, and different applications of things. And then all the assumptions in correlation analysis must be measured and looked into, and alternate options must also be evaluated. So just like I said earlier, we went more into Spearmans and how, with Pearsons, you need to know the how, what, when, and why of why you're doing that correlation. What are you trying to measure? What are you trying to prove? And then you also have to know when you're going to turn over to an alternate correlation, be it Spearman's correlation. So there are important terms here like effect size, p-values, and r-values. So we went into a deeper dive about effect levels. And that's a certain ratio where you can come in low, medium, or high on the effect level that is generated. And that also ties into an R value and your P value. All this ties into, what level of effect is it? Let's say it's at a 500 or 300. It's a medium effect, but you're at a 0.05. So you're also statistically significant. So you can take that variable that you're looking at and you can say this was a medium effect at a statistical significance at GILT or whatever variable you're analyzing at the time. So I learned a lot of tricks and different things in Jamovi, and I learned how to interpret data, and especially learned how to interpret the significance of data and compare many different variables to each other to see what was statistical and what was not statistical. Dove into more p-values, learned more about effect size, learned all about correlations. It's important to know in correlations, this is not experimental. There's no controls. There's no manipulations. The correlation types are natural, observational, and archival. Archival is from the past. Observational, you're observing it. And naturalistics, it's naturally occurring. So just again, correlations are not any type of experiment. They're when you're just looking at the differences between variables using this analysis. But you have to understand the meanings, the applications, the assumptions. You have to know what different correlations you can use. Are you going to use Pearson's? Are you going to use Spearman's? Or, what are you going to use to get this data out there where you can interpret it and apply it and descriptively talk about it in APA style. And it's important, like once you learn your p-value, your r-value, what your different effect sizes are, how to write them and how to read them and how to interpret what they all mean together. And Jamovi did a great job of collecting the data, reporting the data, and analyzing the data. And that data would come in either positive or negative. It did not just get rejected if it was negative. If it was statistically significant and it was negative, it still had some form of effect based on where it hit that scale in the effect scale. So just important to realize. So quick overview. This class was great. I learned so much. I like how we started off with the fundamentals and terminology. We went into, all the different scales. We went into the different graphs. We went into what is validity, what is bias in the very beginning, just as a good overview. And then at the end of the class, we were talking about validity again. We were talking about graphs. We were talking about significance. We were tying all that information that we learned throughout the class into the Jamovi system, where we were generating that data, analyzing that data, and interpreting that data. Before I took this class, I hadn't been familiar with all these different graphs. I didn't know I could find outliers and histograms, and I hadn't used scatter plots that many times. I'd used histograms for frequency, but, you know, I just learned a lot more about graphs and different scales and what they're measuring at times and why the scales are important, and it's important how you word questions on scales. And it's important that you start with negative questions and go to positive questions. It's important that you use an equal number of positive and negative questions. It's important on your survey that, how are you asking the questions? Are you using inclusive language? Is there bias? How do you try to control against bias? And that's a tricky one, but it always comes down to help people understand the goal, help them understand while they're taking the survey, what the survey is about. The more you can explain to them, the better. And then the common good, how is this going to help them? How is it going to help the organization? And again, if there's less trust in the organization, put the demographics at the end, ask less questions there, allow people to skip questions. A survey can be long or it can be short. It just depends. In most cases, if it's short, you get more response time. But some people argue it can be long, just as long as people are engaged and committed to the mission of the survey. Surveys can be anywhere from, it's typically 50 to 80 questions and about 30 minutes. But there are things that you need to know about the survey before you conduct the survey. And that is, what is the best time to conduct the survey? How long should it be? Who should your target audience be? Should you use negative words? Are they essential in certain questions? What type of survey should you use? And what's the minimum number of people needed for the survey? And to make sure that when you get that target population, it is focused on the areas that you need it to focus. So, week 3, we really drove into the population. We need to focus on how the survey should be done, if we should use a stratified or consensus survey, when to do the surveys, different measures needed to represent different populations, and stratified random surveys that are more costly and most time consuming. So most of the time people use sample surveys, but it just depends on what you're looking for and what you need. And I'd say week 4 was probably the most fun, where we got into cleaning and screening information and learning how to impute information where it needed, learn how to scrub it, learn how to clean it, screen it, learn, all the things you need to do to get that data ready to analyze. You can't just take the data and go forth. You have to look at your direct methods. You have to look at your instructional methods, your archival methods, and figure out, okay, where am I on this? And you have to know all the different things like reverse coding, how to sum it, how to average it. Now, week 6 dove into validity and reliability. We all know how important that is. And we will be figuring that out when we get the right survey to look at. We learned about Cronbach's alpha and t-tests, and they are used to generate and interpret our findings that we find. And then we learned about Pearson's and the assumptions of Pearson's that need to be met. And then when you would go to Spearman's and use that as a correlation analysis, very important to know what correlation analysis are out there and what ones you should use. So, and then week 7, we dove even more into correlation analysis. We dove even more into Pearson's and when to use Spearman's. We learned basically how to identify assumptions, meanings, and applications. That was very important. And we needed to learn about different correlations. We needed to learn about effect size. What does that mean? What's low, medium, and high effect size? How does that tie into your p-value? What is a statistically significant p-value? What happens if there's a negative in your effect number? It's very important. Also, just don't forget, in correlations, they're not experiments. We do not manipulate them. We analyze them, we interpret them, and we gather data out of that with a lot of different correlations between the variables that help us interpret, okay, is this a positive correlation? Is this a negative correlation? And they're not going to be either unless they have a significant unless they have statistical significance. So that's about all. I tried to be brief. It's 30 minutes, but thank you.